The first thing Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole noticed was how loud his own breathing sounded inside his helmet. It was ragged and too fast, fighting with the crack of rifle fire that shredded the jungle around him. Dirt peppered the side of his face as another burst of rounds chewed into the tree just inches from where his head had been a second earlier. He pressed himself deeper into the muddy slope, fingers clawing for any bit of root or rock that felt like cover. The air stank of burned powder, wet leaves, and the metallic edge of blood. For a heartbeat, he couldn't remember exactly how he'd gotten here. There had been a patrol, a ridgeline, a valley that looked too quiet for how close it lay to known enemy routes. Then there had been movement, too much, too fast, and now he was hugging the hillside while what felt like half the Viet Cong army hammered his position. He forced himself to look up. Across the narrow valley on the opposite slope, muzzle flashes winked in the shadows. Fire poured down in coordinated, disciplined bursts, AK-47s. One, maybe two RPD light machine guns, he guessed, from the rhythm of the fire. Runners moved between positions, low and fast, relaying orders. The hillside opposite wasn't just random scattered fire, it was a living wall of rifles. He started to count without even thinking about it, the way experience had trained him to do. 1 firing point. 2, see. 3 clustered near a rock outcropping. Another pair slightly higher, staggered for overlapping fields of fire. A machine gun dug in at the center, chewing the slope where his men had tried to find cover. More to the flanks. More behind those. He did the math in his head, cold and detached even as adrenaline pounded in his veins. At least 50 rifles, he thought. Maybe more. 50 to 1. Someone screamed to his left, a raw, ripping sound that cut off abruptly. To his right, another voice shouted for a medic, words dissolving into a choked gurgle. Cole clenched his jaw and kept his cheek pressed into the dirt. Every part of his body wanted to curl tighter, to become smaller, to disappear into the hillside, but that wasn't going to happen. Not today, not here. He reached for the radio handset attached to the RTO's rig beside him, fingers fumbling over the plastic. Static hissed back at him, thick and useless. Somewhere in the noise, distant voices overlapped. Other units calling for fire missions, pilots talking to forward air controllers, fragments of coordinates and call signs. Nothing that sounded like it gave one damn about the fact that a small American element had walked straight into a prepared kill zone. Charlie 2-6, this is Cole, he shouted into the handset, hoping the platoon net was still alive. We are in a heavy ambush, repeat, heavy ambush, taking fire from multiple positions. We need... The reply was a high-pitched whine and a burst of static. No clear voice, no orders, no help. He let the handset drop for a second and pressed the back of his head into the hillside, eyes closed. If he stayed here, he knew exactly how this ended. The enemy would keep pounding the slope, keeping everyone pinned, and then when they'd inflicted enough damage, they would send fire teams down to mop up. It would be efficient, clean in the way that killing ever could be. They'd done this before. You didn't set a trap this well without practice. A hand clamped around his boot and he almost fired by reflex. He twisted and found Specialist Luis Morales staring at him, eyes wide under his helmet. Morales's face was streaked with mud and terror, the heavy radio still strapped to his back. "Sarge!" Morales yelled over the gunfire. "We're getting slaughtered! I can't raise anyone!" What do we do? Cole forced himself to push the fear aside. Rank meant more than stripes in moments like this. It meant clarity when everyone else saw only chaos. He grabbed Morales by his vest and hauled him closer until their helmets nearly touched. "We're not dying on this slope," Cole said, voice flat and hard. "You hear me? We stay where they want us, we're dead. Only way out is not down, it's up." Morales stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Up? Sarge, there's nothing up there but more hill. And no one's shooting at it," Cole snapped back. "They're poured in on the low ground. They think we're pinned. We go up and over. We get behind them. We move, or we're done." He risked another glance upslope. The ground above them was steep, muddy, and choked with brush. There was no real path, no easy route, just a tangle of roots, rocks, and low-hanging branches. But he was right. Most of the enemy fire was angled lower, focused on the shape still visible between trees and rocks, not on the band of jungle higher up. They had built a perfect cage, but they had left the top of it thin. Cole felt a strange calm settle over him beneath the fear, a narrow line of focus he'd only felt a handful of times in his life. This was bad, worse than bad, but it wasn't hopeless. Not yet. "On my count," he shouted to Morales, "we crawl. No standing, no popping up and being a hero. You move when I move. 3 seconds at a time, find anything that looks like cover, then we go again. You keep that radio on your back. If we get high enough, we might find a hole in the static. Understood?" Morales nodded, throat bobbing. "Understood." Cole picked a point-up slope, a dark trunk of a tree with twisted roots cutting across the ground like veins. 10 yards. That was all he needed to reach first. "Now!" he roared. He launched forward, body low, pulling himself through the mud on elbows and knees. Rounds snapped over his back, some so close he felt the hot slap of displaced air on his neck. Bark exploded from a tree trunk to his right, showering him with splinters. He ignored it, eyes locked on the tree ahead. He slid in behind it and slammed his shoulder into its rough bark. Morales dove in next to him a heartbeat later, gasping. "That's one," Cole said. "Again. Move, breathe, collapse behind the next stump. Move again." The world shrank to 3-second bursts of terror and desperate momentum. They clawed up the hill, muscles burning, lungs screaming, the radio clattering against Morales' back with every lurch. Behind them, the slope they'd abandoned was being methodically shredded by fire, aimed at bodies that weren't there anymore. At one point, a round grazed Cole's sleeve, tugging the fabric and carving a hot line across his skin. He didn't look at it, didn't have time. Pain meant he was still alive. If he was still alive, he could keep moving. They reached the edge of the high brush and collapsed into it, disappearing from sight. The change was immediate. Sound dampened. The angle of incoming fire shifted slightly lower. Visibility dropped. Up here in the shadows of the thicker jungle, they were no longer shapes silhouetted against the slope. They were ghosts. Cole sucked in a breath and let it out slowly. "You good?" he asked. "Define good," Morales managed. "I'm not dead. That's good enough for now." He crawled forward another few feet until he found a small gap between leaves, a natural blind looking back down into the valley. From this higher vantage point, he finally saw the whole thing clearly. The enemy positions were like a textbook diagram brought to life, interlocking arcs of fire, staggered teams, a machine gun anchoring the center, riflemen guarding likely escape routes. Whoever had set this up knew exactly what they were doing. He also saw something else. None of them, none were looking up into the high brush behind them. They were fixated on the Americans they'd trapped. They were confident, and confidence could be exploited. Morales was fiddling with the radio, mouth tight as he turned dials. "Still getting crap," he muttered. "A lot of traffic, but nothing clear. They're too far, terrain's bad, and this thing took a hit." "Forget higher," Cole said. "Right now, we're higher." Morales blinked. "What?" Cole slid his rifle into position and took aim at the nearest enemy firing point. From the front, it would have been nearly impossible to pick a target through the jumble of trunks and brush. From up here, he could see the tops of heads, shoulders, backs. Men crouched behind cover that was never meant to protect them from someone above and behind. He lined up the first shot on a man feeding a belt into the machine gun. The gunner was focused entirely downslope, firing short, controlled bursts into where he thought the Americans remained. Cole exhaled, let his heart rate settle for a brief second, and squeezed the trigger. The man jerked and dropped, the belt spilling from his hands. The gunner glanced sideways in confusion. Cole shot him next, the bullet catching him behind the ear. The machine gun slumped silent. Morales flinched beside him. "Holy, start counting," Cole said. "Not out loud. Just remember it later. People are going to ask." He shifted slightly and put his scope on the next cluster of fighters. One of them was standing to shout an order, gesturing down the hill. Cole shot him in the center of the chest. The man crumpled backward, his words dying with him. Another enemy fighter turned toward the sound of the shot. Confusion etched across his face. Cole was already on him. Another squeeze. Another body hitting the dirt. The firing pattern across the valley began to stutter. It didn't stop entirely. There were too many rifles for that. But the cohesion, the steady rhythm faltered. When a machine gun in the center of your line suddenly goes dark, and 3 men around it drop for no visible reason, even seasoned fighters hesitate. Cole took advantage of every hesitation. He moved along the high line, staying as low as he could, picking his shots carefully. A man leaning too far out from behind a rock, another running ammunition to a forward position, a leader pointing and shouting. Each time one shot, one target removed from the fight. 50-1, Morales murmured under his breath, as if finally understanding the odds they were facing. "Not if they can't figure out where you are," Cole replied. Below in the valley, he could see movement where his platoon had been trapped. Men were crawling, dragging themselves to new positions, seizing whatever cover they could as the enemy's fire weakened. He saw a few small groups begin to peel away, falling back along the slope in controlled bounds instead of panic. They didn't know why everything had changed. They didn't have to. All they had to do was move. A burst of fire tore into the brush less than a foot from Cole's face, shredding leaves. Dirt sprayed over him. The enemy was finally starting to realize something was wrong on their flank. A few rifles were angling higher. Someone, somewhere, had enough sense to start scanning the tree line behind them. "Time to shift," Cole said. "We can't sit in one hole and expect them not to figure it out." He crawled sideways through the brush, pulling Morales with him. They moved in a slow arc, keeping their silhouette broken up by leaves and trunks, never staying in one spot long enough to invite a sustained volley. Every few yards, Cole would settle in, fire another carefully placed shot, and then move again. In between engagements, he listened. The shouted Vietnamese commands were harder to pass at this distance, but the tone told him enough. Confusion was creeping in. The perfect ambush was fraying at the edges. Units were asking for clarity. Leaders were scrambling to adjust. He saw one of those leaders, a man with a different cut to his uniform and a pistol on his hip, stand up long enough to point wildly upslope and shout. Cole shot him in the throat. The man went down, clutching at his neck, his words gurgling into nothing. "Add one," Cole muttered. He wasn't sure when he started counting again. The number didn't matter in this moment. What mattered was that each man he dropped meant fewer bullets aimed at the remnants of his platoon. Minutes stretched and blurred. His shoulder throbbed from the steady recoil. His cheek was sore where it pressed against the stock. He lost track of how many times he and Morales shifted position, how many times he fired, how many times he saw men spin and fall without ever knowing who had killed them. At some point he glanced downslope and realized something important had changed. The fire from the enemy line had dropped from a crushing barrage to scattered bursts. Several positions on the opposite slope were abandoned, their occupants either dead or pulled back. The machine gun they'd silenced had not been replaced. The valley no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a place the Americans could escape from if they were fast and ruthless enough. "Morales," Cole said, "try that radio again." Morales adjusted the dials with hands that were still shaking but steadier than before. He keyed the handset. Any station. This is Delta 2-4, fire team element in contact. Heavy ambush broken. Requesting immediate support for withdrawal. Over." This time a voice came back through the static. "Delta 2-4, this is Falcon. Say your location and status." Morales looked at Cole, eyes wide. Cole rattled off their grid as best he could remember it, adding what he was seeing now. Enemy positions degraded, some withdrawing. Americans attempting to fall back. Terrain. Possible landing zone options. "Copy that," the voice said. "We've got artillery on standby and fast movers about 8 minutes out. Can you mark enemy positions?" "Negative," Cole replied. "They're too scattered now. Best you can do is hit the ridgeline they were on. We're working their flank." There was a pause. "Working their flank? How many of you?" Cole looked at Morales, then back at the radio. "2," he said simply. Silence, then one short response. "Roger, 2 is enough if you're still talking. Stand by." He set the handset down and went back to the rifle, knowing that 8 minutes in a fight like this was both very short and impossibly long. The enemy hadn't completely broken yet. Some groups were pulling back in an orderly fashion, still firing as they moved, still dangerous. A few looked like they were searching for him specifically, eyes and rifles hunting the high brush. He picked off 2 of the ones who seemed most intent on finding him. 1 shot, 2 shots. His magazine ran dry. He swapped it calmly for the next one, fingers moving by habit. His brain registered that this was his last full magazine. After that, he'd be counting individual rounds. He kept shooting anyway. At last, a new sound joined the fading rattle of gunfire, the distant thunder of jets. The jungle canopy swallowed some of it, but not all. He felt the vibration in his chest before he saw anything. Then, far off to the south, 2 specks screamed into view, growing larger by the second. "Here we go," he murmured. Artillery came first. A metallic shriek, then a series of crushing impacts erupted along the far slope and crest, tearing trees out of the earth and sending plumes of smoke and dirt skyward. The enemy line disintegrated. Whatever cohesion remained, shattered under the weight of high explosives. Men who weren't already dead or retreating were now being flung from their positions or buried under debris. The jets rolled in next, strafing the edges of the valley where the Viet Cong might be trying to regroup. Cole and Morales kept their heads low, trusting the coordinates they'd given were good enough, praying that whoever was pulling the triggers understood how close friendly forces had been. The world turned into a rolling wave of sound and concussion. Then, just as suddenly, it began to quiet. When the echoes faded and the smell of burned vegetation mixed with everything else, Cole finally lifted his head. Smoke hung in layers over the valley. The opposite slope was a patchwork of craters, shattered trees, and dark, motionless shapes. Here and there a wounded man crawled or dragged himself deeper into the jungle, but there was no organized fire anymore, no structure. The 50-to-1 advantage had been broken, crushed by a combination of one stubborn sergeant and a lot of steel. He slumped back against a tree trunk, chest heaving. Morales let out a long, shuddering laugh that sounded half hysterical. "I can't believe we're still alive," Morales said. Cole looked at him, then out over the shattered valley. "Believe it later," he said. "Right now we find out who else made it." They worked their way downslope cautiously, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning for any sign of movement that didn't look like friendly forces. As they came closer to where the platoon had been pinned, the cost of the ambush became clearer. Bodies lay where men had tried to dig themselves deeper into the earth, their helmets knocked off, weapons fallen from slack hands. Some faces he recognized, some he didn't want to look at long enough to identify. But there were other shapes moving too, men bandaging each other, a medic kneeling over a wounded soldier, hands working furiously. A few heads turned as Cole and Morales emerged from the brush, disbelief written across their faces. Lieutenant Harris, his helmet knocked crooked and one sleeve soaked in blood, limped toward them with the help of another soldier. "Cole," Harris said, voice hoarse. "I thought you were gone." "Not yet, sir," Cole replied. Harris squinted past them, up at the ridge, behind. "You two were up there the whole time?" "Most of it," Cole said. Harris shook his head, a tired grin flickering for a moment. "Someone's going to want to know how 50 armed men lost control of a perfect ambush. It stopped being perfect when they forgot to look up," Cole said. "They didn't linger. The valley was still dangerous. Stragglers could still be out there. A second force could be moving in. With help now on the way and the immediate threat broken, the priority shifted to getting the wounded out and the survivors to a safer position." Hours later, back at a forward base, after the wounded had been evacuated and the dead lined up under ponchos, someone sat Cole down in front of a folding table with a map on it and a legal pad beside it. A captain he didn't know and a major he barely recognized from briefings looked at him with a mix of curiosity and calculation. "Walk us through it, Sergeant," the captain said. "From the first contact." Cole did. He described the patrol, the sudden eruption of fire, the layout of the enemy positions as he'd seen them. He talked about the decision to go upslope, about the gap he'd spotted in their coverage, about the angle of fire he'd used to start dismantling their line. He spoke in simple terms, without embellishment, as if he were giving a range report rather than recounting how he'd walked into a 50-to-1 fight and walked out again. The major scribbled notes. "Do you have any idea how many you hit, Sergeant?" he asked at last. Cole hesitated. Faces flashed through his mind. Men dropping at machine guns, runners cut down mid-step, leaders collapsing in mid-command. He had been too busy staying alive to assign numbers then. But in the quiet of the briefing tent, the tally formed whether he wanted it to or not. "Sir," he said slowly, "I'd guess more than 20, less than 30. I wasn't counting for glory. I was counting so our guys could move." The captain glanced at the major, then back at Cole. "The recon team that went back over the ridge after the strike puts it closer to 27 confirmed bodies in positions that match angles from your location. They're calling it one of the most lopsided engagements they've seen in this sector." Cole shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. "With respect, sir, there were a lot of things that turned that fight. Air support, artillery, those pilots, and one staff sergeant who refused to die where he was told to," the major cut in. "There was no ceremony that day, no medals pinned, no speeches made. There wasn't time, and the war had a way of swallowing individual acts into the endless grind of operations." Cole left the tent and went back to his men, helping them clean weapons, writing letters for the ones who'd lost friends they couldn't bring themselves to write about. But the story traveled anyway. It moved in whispers at first, between platoons, between units who shared the same muddy tent city and the same 2 short stretches of bad sleep. Then it moved farther, carried by pilots who'd flown over that valley, by artillery officers who'd fired the missions that saved the remnants of a battered platoon, by commanders who talked quietly among themselves about what a single determined man could do in the worst possible odds. They said he'd been outnumbered 50-to-1. They said he'd turned a perfect ambush into a rout. They said he'd broken an entire enemy force with a rifle and a decision to move where no one expected. Cole never called himself a hero. When younger soldiers later asked him about that day, he told them only this: "Sometimes the math looks bad. Sometimes it is bad. But if you can find one place the enemy isn't looking, if you can make yourself move when everything in you wants to freeze, the numbers start to change. Not because they got smaller, because you refused to be part of their equation." He had walked into a valley meant to be a grave. He had walked out alive. And somewhere in a war full of forgotten firefights and unmarked hillsides, a ridgeline in Vietnam quietly held the story of the day 50 rifles weren't enough.